"That's not his wife!" a grubby little girl screamed as the millionaire was about to kiss the woman at the altar. Then she rips off the bride's veil, and everyone is shocked to discover something. Rate my story from 0 to 10. Your feedback is important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on you. The shout sliced through the still afternoon air like a knife, echoing through the cobblestone streets of the historic town at precisely 3 p.m. The 52-year-old widowed millionaire nearly dropped his coffee cup as he backed away from the window of his luxury condo. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For the past 3 weeks, that sound had been coming from the Victorian house across the street, a faded yellow 2-story structure with peeling blue window frames that clashed with the sleekness of the modern building where he lived. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, adjusting his tie before returning to his work. As the owner of the largest construction firm in the region, he was used to solving complex problems, but preferred to steer clear of other people's drama. Especially after 5 years of living alone, ever since he lost his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. His fortune, amassed through investments in Wall Street stocks and real estate ventures, had created a comfortable barrier between him and the outside world. Across the street, inside the Victorian house, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her young mind unable to understand why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman held a metal spoon firmly in her hand, having heated it on the gas stove, her eyes bloodshot from the whiskey she'd been drinking since noon at the local dive bar. "You're a curse on this house," the cruel aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the booze. "Because of you, my sister's gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red welt that would join the other scars dotting her thin limbs. The girl bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She had learned that screams only enraged her aunt further, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The little girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice, singing that lullaby before she went to sleep. It was all that was left of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Stop sniveling," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon away in the cabinet as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you smudge the walls again with that filthy charcoal, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up under the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's song softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The millionaire stopped reviewing contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she was cooking, a popular tune about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the Victorian house. One of the back windows was slightly ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. His net worth in dollars had grown exponentially in recent years, but his connection to the real world had diminished in equal proportion. Next door to the Victorian house, the 61-year-old retired school teacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike the millionaire, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress. And that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. That's strange, she thought, watching the windows of the neighboring house, a family she had known for decades. The aunt had always been troubled, but ever since she took custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran in the streets like the other children in the historic town. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had properly spoken to the cruel aunt, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little girl better. Meanwhile, the millionaire remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of his former employee who had abruptly resigned 5 years ago, a few months before the accident. She was a gentle woman, always humming as she organized the construction company's files. Then, suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again, until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to be suffering in silence. The echo of that childish melody continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running from his responsibilities. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical bustle of the historic town awakening to another day. The retired schoolteacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the Victorian house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The cruel aunt opened the door with a swollen face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," said the teacher, with her gentlest smile. "I've come to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've talked properly." The aunt hesitated, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "It's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The teacher took a step forward, forcing the woman to retreat. "And I would really like to meet your niece. I heard she's a lovely little girl." The aunt's face hardened for a moment before forcing a weak smile. "The girl is sick. High fever. Best not to get close." At that moment a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher perked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Maybe I can help," insisted the educator. "I have experience with sick children. I raised 3 kids, you know how it is." "No need, no need," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just the flu. It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol emanating from her even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the millionaire watched the scene from his window while eating breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confusing dreams where a child's voice mingled with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the Victorian house, a strange curiosity overcame him. The educator finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not before casting an inquisitive glance at the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the Victorian house, the aunt locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl huddled behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" growled the aunt, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty," the girl murmured, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" the aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the backyard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single mango tree. There, she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the gas stove. It was always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the girl in the yard under the hot midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So, she began to hum her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was that melody that reached the millionaire's ears again. This time, he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar about that voice, that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His employee used to hum that same song while working. The woman who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. The woman who always spoke fondly about her young daughter, a girl named... "It's her," murmured the millionaire, his cell phone trembling in his hands. His former employee's daughter was named that. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of the gentlewoman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made that connection before? The millionaire put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered his employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems at the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now 5 years later, his employee's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including regret for not helping when she clearly needed it. His profits and dividends had grown substantially since then, but what good was all this capital if he couldn't protect an innocent child? At 3 o'clock, sharp, the screams started again. This time, the millionaire didn't turn away from the window. He watched with growing horror as, through the kitchen window of the Victorian house, he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently in the direction of a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the millionaire couldn't pretend they were just childhood tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? His income had provided him with a comfortable life, but he had never faced a situation like this. That night, the girl slept on the floor of the backyard, where her aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the mango tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her away from that place of pain. Across the street, the millionaire couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's departure. 3 days had passed since the millionaire discovered the child's identity, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired schoolteacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering just meters from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the Victorian house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting a new direct visit to the cruel aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from where she had the best view of the backyard of the Victorian house. What she saw left her horrified. The girl was sitting under the mango tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing in the dirt with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "My God!" whispered the educator, her hands trembling as she held the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined, much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," said the girl in her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, sweetie," replied the teacher, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you all right?" The girl glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "Yes, I'm fine. I'm just drawing birdies." "That's nice. You like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," replied the child, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the educator's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Where are you, girl?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran inside the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, the millionaire had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he managed to see the yard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him nauseous. For the first time in 5 years, he felt a genuine rage burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family who lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. His assets and investments in gold meant nothing in the face of that child's suffering. At 11 o'clock in the morning, the teacher made a courageous decision. She put on her best dress clothes, took a tray of homemade cookies she had prepared as a pretext, and headed to the Victorian house again. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's insistence. "I already told you it's not a good time." "Honey, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," interrupted the teacher firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little girl better. As long-time neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the Victorian house was dark and smelled of mildew mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," lied the aunt, blocking the way to the back of the house. "That's a shame." "Maybe another time then," said the teacher, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the gas stove, and above all, small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The teacher and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbor's cat," said the aunt quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The teacher smiled and nodded, but had decided she had seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always here next door if you need anything." Anything at all. The educator's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the teacher left, the aunt locked the door tightly and went to the kitchen, where she found the girl huddled behind the gas stove, trying to hide. The child had cried upon hearing the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," accused the aunt, her eyes already shining with familiar fury. "No, Auntie, I didn't make noise," protested the girl, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt picked up the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The girl recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to attract attention, don't you?" hissed the aunt as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here asking questions? You think I can't take care of you?" Across the street, the millionaire had positioned his cell phone on the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated woman who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. His funds and investments in treasury bonds had grown exponentially, but he had never used his wealth for something truly important. As the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the millionaire made a call he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend. "I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the girl's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it could be a matter of life and death." On the other end of the line, his lawyer friend perceived the urgency in his voice. "What's going on? Are you all right?" "It's not me. It's a 4-year-old girl who lives in the house across the street from me. She's being abused." "I have evidence." There was a pause on the phone. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, we need to act immediately. Can you come to my office now?" "I'll be there in an hour," replied the millionaire, looking once more at the Victorian house, where the girl faced her daily demons. That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to slip quietly into the backyard. Her new burns stung, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the mango tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song softly. What she didn't know was that, for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering, and that in the coming days her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. The millionaire had finally decided to use his profitability and resources for something that really mattered. The lawyer arrived at the millionaire's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been classmates at university nearly 3 decades ago, and the lawyer knew well the emotional isolation his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," said the lawyer, sitting in the spacious living room of the apartment. "You spoke about a child in danger, but I need details." The millionaire poured coffee and stood next to the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being abused by the aunt who takes care of her." "Abused how?" asked the lawyer, taking a notepad out of his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The millionaire paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, evidence of what's happening." The lawyer was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately." "I know," replied the millionaire, running his hands over his face. "But there's something else. My employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before my wife's accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," completed the lawyer, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The millionaire nodded. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have needed to leave her daughter with that woman." At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and the lawyer could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "This happens every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 o'clock religiously, but sometimes at other times as well," replied the millionaire, picking up his cell phone. "Want to see the recordings?" The lawyer watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a specialist in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence deeply disturbed him. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the District Attorney's Office. That child needs to be removed from that house immediately." As the two men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl was living another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol at home. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the girl had made on the kitchen wall during the early hours. "How many times do I have to tell you not to smudge the walls?" screamed the aunt, holding the girl by the arm with enough force to leave marks. "You're a plague, a curse on this house." The girl tried to explain herself, to say that she had dreamed about her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," continued the aunt, pushing the child down the hall. "And if I hear even one noise, you're going to experience a punishment you've never experienced before." The room where the girl was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to sing her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten she existed. It was that song that the retired teacher heard when she passed by the house on her way to the grocery store. The educator had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, about the marks she had seen on the child's arms, about the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. The teacher stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but filled with a sadness that broke the educator's heart. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the grocery store, the teacher went directly to the city center, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the counselor well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. "I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," said the teacher, entering the office without ceremony. The counselor looked up from the papers she was analyzing. "Teacher, good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger. My neighbor. I'm sure she's being abused." The counselor straightened up in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years in office, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and the teacher was not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," said the counselor, taking a complaint form. While the teacher reported her observations across town, the lawyer was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. The prosecutor listened carefully as he presented the evidence collected by the millionaire. "It's compelling evidence," said the prosecutor, examining the videos on his cell phone. "I'm going to order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will that take?" asked the lawyer, concerned. "With this evidence, we can act today," replied the prosecutor. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services now." Thus it was that by a coincidence that would change the girl's fate, two simultaneous complaints reached Child Protective Services on the same morning. The counselor was finishing noting the teacher's account when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services speaking. This is the prosecutor. I need you to make an urgent intervention at a house on Main Street. We have evidence of serious child abuse." The counselor paused, her pen suspended over the paper. "Is it by any chance the number of the yellow Victorian house?" "Exactly. How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," replied the counselor, looking at the teacher with surprise. "Two independent sources. This confirms the seriousness of the situation." At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. The counselor, accompanied by two social workers and a bailiff, was heading to the Victorian house. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The millionaire watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. His business and cash flow had provided him with stability, but he had never used his resources for something so important. "You did the right thing," said the lawyer, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the millionaire, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the Victorian house. In the house, the aunt had gone out to buy alcohol at the local bar, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child continued to sing softly, unaware that her life was about to change in a radical way. When the counselor knocked on the door of the Victorian house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was the teacher who first heard the faint voice coming from the room at the back. "Someone's in here," she said, guiding the team down the hallway. When they opened the bedroom door and found the girl huddled in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child looked up with wide, frightened eyes, not understanding who these people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, sweetie," said the counselor, crouching down to get to the child's level. "My name is Anna. We're here to help you." The girl looked at the teacher, recognizing the kind lady who had talked to her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but was quickly replaced by fear. "Auntie's gonna be mad," she whispered. "You don't need to worry about that now," said the teacher, reaching out her hand to the child. "We're going to get you out of here, okay?" And so, after months of silent suffering, the girl was finally removed from the house where she had known only pain and fear. The departure was a moment that would be etched in the memory of everyone present, especially the millionaire who watched from the window, finally feeling that he had honored the memory of his former employee. 3 months later, the girl was living in a loving foster home, while the legal process ran its course. The millionaire, discovering that she had no living relatives to take custody of her, began the proceedings to officially adopt her. His fortune, accumulated in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, finally had a true purpose. The first time the child called him Daddy, he knew he had found the meaning he had been seeking since his wife's departure. And when she sang her mother's song in her new home, it was no longer a sound of suffering, but of hope reborn.